Sequels, as I'm sure we're all more than familiar with by this point, tend to get very interesting reactions when they're released. But even more interesting is the reaction that sequels are made many, many years, usually a decade or more after the previous installment, get from both the public and critics. Usually they tend to split people right down the middle, and I don't need to cite the many, many examples of this happening within just even the last couple of years. One need only look at, say, Live Free or Die Hard or Kingdom of the Crystal Skull for pretty much the epitome of it. Really, the only sequel that seems to have escaped this fate is Martin Scorsese's The Color of Money, which was a sequel to Robert Rosen's much-beloved The Hustler. Thus enters into the equation Tron Legacy, a film made almost 30 years after the original. Let's get to talking about Legacy, a film that was stuck in development hell for pretty much all those years, going through a number of different scripts and directors and ideas for how the story could continue. When we left off in the original, Flynn had overcome the villain and managed to regain the company. So what could they do next, was the big question. Well, in 2010, Disney tried to give us an answer by giving $200 million to Joseph Kosinski, a first-time director, with, well, this. Flynn's son trying to figure out what happened to his father all those years ago, not long after the events of the first film, and while subsequently re-entering the world of Tron, which has since become a significantly darker place, and in fact changed up its more colourful palette for a more neon on black look, which is one of the film's strong points. Within, he finds that the world has been taken over by Clue, a computer program that has the appearance, or rather the younger appearance, of his father, thus at first fooling Flynn's son Sam. Of course, he escapes and finds out that his father is indeed in the computer world and that, well, things have turned pretty pear-shaped since the original. Once the film hit theaters, it made money, about $400 million, give or take, but the reviews and the reaction from the public were pretty split, with people giving general praise to the high quality of the visuals and action, and even Daft Punk's pretty damn good electronic soundtrack, but a lot of the criticism being directed at the performances, the characters, and in particular the story. So, where do I stand on this? Well, I'm afraid to say I'm definitely more nay than yay. The visuals, I agree, are spectacular, and it's a great update. Whoever was the art director on this project, I tip my hat to you, sir. You've created one of the most visually distinctive films within recent memory. The black on predominantly whites creates a great atmosphere. But the story itself is a very different question, and even to a certain extent some of the performances. Where do I start? No, really, where could I start? I mean, there are a couple of big thorns in the bush here that just really, really irked me when I saw it, and since then, they've never quite gone out of my mind when I think back to this film. I suppose the main one is the main character, Sam, both in terms of the actual character itself, the way it's written, and, well, Garrett Hedlund's performance. Hedlund was mainly a supporting actor for many years before this was pretty much his first big leading role break. And, well, I'm not gonna lie, he's not very, well, good. Garrett just doesn't have charisma. He doesn't have any sort of energy or pizzazz. And it doesn't help that he delivers most of his lines in this sort of distant monotone. Remember, this guy is supposed to be the son of Kevin Flynn. You would expect him to have at least a smidgen, a little itty bit of his father's charisma and energy. Not to be cruel, but frankly I can see why in this case the dude most certainly did not abide. And not only does that lack of charisma hurt the performance, but it's very much reflected in the writing. Sam is just not a terribly interesting character. He is very much just sort of that kind of lost young person who's sort of not quite sure what they want to do with their lives, but he goes on the investigation anyway. Again, in principle, not really a bad idea necessarily. This could give us a window into his character, into his mindset, and give us a chance to really relate and sympathize with him as he goes on this journey to find his father and figure out what is going on. But Sam just doesn't have any real personality or qualities to him that really make him endearing. Really, all we ever truly know about him is that he likes motorbikes and that he's trying to figure out what happened to his dad. There's not much personality here besides that, and considering he's the character we spend most of the movie with, that's a pretty big problem. Even Shia LaBeouf, as the incredibly annoying character in Transformers, at least had some kind of personality, albeit as a geeky stereotype. And of course, because we have such an ultimately not particularly strong lead, this knocks back into the story itself. The first 20 or so minutes when we're with him in the real world before he gets sucked into the world of Tron are not exactly very interesting. Really, it's more just to bridge the gap between the two films, which is understandable enough, and unlike, say, the dreadful first act in John Carter, which was very drawn out and didn't really make much use of the Civil War setting before we got to Mars, this at least makes sense, considering it has to explain what has happened within the time, and to be fair, it's not in some kind of overloaded narration or text scroll. We actually see it through images, which is something I can give Kaczynski points over most other directors. But when we enter the world of Tron, it very much suffers from what a lot of summer movies lately, especially some of Disney's ones, like Oz the Great and the Powerful, have fallen under. The opening, as far as the Tron world of the grid is concerned, is actually quite a bit of fun, seeing him in the stadium and indeed meeting up with Clue for the first time. We get the cool light disc battles and the light cycle scene, and, well, so far so good. And then the last third is actually quite a bit of fun as well, especially seeing the aerial battles, something that we did not get in the first film. So we got some meat on the opening and ending, sure, but why haven't I mentioned the middle? Oh boy, oh boy. Tron Legacy is one of the few films where, and I'm saying this as a writer and filmmaker myself, where I have seen the movie pretty much both figuratively and literally, since this is what Olivia Wilde actually does in the film, slam hard on the brakes for about half an hour, just to fill us in on everything that's been happening in the grid since, well, Flynn went missing originally. Now you may be wondering, but why is that a big deal? Don't lots of films have that bit where they fill in about the history of the world? The problem is the way they do it here. The movie pretty much stops all momentum, and everything outside of what is going on between Flynn and his son is pretty much never brought up at any point during the sequence. We stop at Flynn's now home, which is a little maisonette out on a cliff, and here is where we get the fill-in as well as the standard "where were you, Dad" kind of banter. The problem with these scenes is the way they're paced and written. As I mentioned, we stay with this group throughout the next good 20 or so minutes. Literally, nothing else happens during this sequence. We don't get any sort of cutbacks to Clue or any of his machinations. We don't get to see what is going on around in the world of the grid. We don't see any sort of attempt by Clue to offer rewards or do anything that you would think a villain like him would be doing if he was searching for a fugitive. We focus exclusively on Flynn and his son, which on paper is not the worst idea in the world, but moving on to the writing, it's just not written terribly well. Most of the sequence is devoted to nothing but info dumping, explaining what is going on, and it's not done in a very careful manner. The film combines narration and flashback together to detail how Clue and Flynn fell out and how the grid ended up in its present state. Flynn just never struck me in either in the first film or even in this one as the kind of person who would deliver these kinds of lines. It doesn't sound right. Remember, he's this laid-back, relaxed, sort of surfer kind of dude, so for him to be delivering this very info-heavy narration just doesn't fit with the character. And it's where the film is most obviously just filling in the gaps. And considering that, again, nothing else is going on during this period, we don't get any sort of cutbacks to anything else, the sequence moves pretty slowly. And it doesn't push the narrative forward. It's really more just fill-in, and because of that, what should be a fast-moving film, like the first one, which had an Odyssey kind of feel to it, basically stops dead in its tracks for a good while. And furthermore, he's on the run. They should have had a little more concern for urgency. I'm not gonna try and actively compare this to the first film, but in the first film we were informed about the world of Tron and how it works as Flynn and Tron and his group were going on their journey to defeat the villain. The narrative was being pushed forward as well as us getting information about this world. Furthermore, the writing problems extended to just straight up bizarre fallacies. Clue, frankly, is not a particularly interesting villain. Bridges does do decently, and to be fair, the effect for his face to make him look younger is not horrible. But Clue is yet another I want to take over the world villain. And his plan is way more ham-fisted than the villain in the first film, who was more about getting information. Which actually would be more fitting for this film, since this is set in more modern times, and of course now, information is a very powerful tool to have, considering the rise of the internet. Aside from the fact that the plan isn't terribly interesting or groundbreaking, it makes no sense. And this is not just applying to this also applies to the end of the film when both Sam and Cora get out of the computer world. How does that work? I'm sorry, how in the world does Clue think he's going to get that army out there in the first place? And how does Cora become flesh and blood? In fact, that is the overall question. How the hell do these computer programs suddenly become flesh and blood? With both Flynns, it makes sense because they were humans originally. But these computer programs were that from the beginning, computer programs. How can they possibly turn into actual flesh and blood beings when they're outside of the grid? There's never any indication at any point, not even a throwaway line of dialogue that remotely indicates that, say, Flynn managed to change some kind of thing within the laser beam that sends people into the world of the grid to sort of be able to construct organic matter out of cybernetic data. Is there some sort of secret program or formula that Flynn figured out that enables cybernetic data to be turned into organic matter? So how does this even work? It's lazy screenwriting that just feels like it's catering, one, for the big action set piece at the end, and two, so that the hero can go away with the girl on the end. Plus, there are a lot of just little technical things that annoy me. And this isn't really that much of a shock, considering this is pretty common among first-time directors. I imagine Disney only hired Joseph Kosinski because, well, like the director of the first film, Steve Lisberger, he had experience in 3D animation beforehand and even studied in that area. So they thought they could make lightning strike twice with the same kind of approach to the filmmaker. But Kosinski's limited experience shows, aside from the awkward pacing at times, there are just little things that irritate me about some of the visual choices he made. There's one shot that in particular stands out to me, and it's a shot when Cora is looking from a cliff onto the main city of the grid, where all the action we saw in the first act and in the third takes place. The city is designed like the Disney castle, yeah, real subtle, guys. And apart from Cora, the cliff, and that one city, there's nothing else. Everything around that castle is barren landscape. Flat, nothing, it's just one big black void. Where are the other cities? Where are landscape details? Things like mountains and hills and, even other buildings, perhaps forts or bases of some kind, maybe factories. Even in the original, you got that the grid was more of a living, breathing world in its own way, and we got to see a bunch of diverse landscapes like hills, mountains, and canyons. We even got to go up into the sky a couple of times to see the world from down below. And remember, that was with technology in the 1980s. There is no reason in the world that there couldn't have been more detail put into this one shot. Once we get into the city itself, it's fine, there's a lot of bright neon architecture, but that shot really irks me because it makes the world of this grid feel much smaller than the original. The original felt very much like a whole world to explore. Here it feels very, very condensed, and that really rubs me the wrong way. And finally, the ideas in the original that had this sort of theological bent and brought up questions about belief and gods and whatnot. While it may not have been super deep, it was interesting and actually gave the film a little more meat. Here, those questions are only ever raised during, again, that 20-minute break slam. And, well, Bridges pretty much has to spell it all out for the audience. So there's nothing remotely interesting, and this concept is never brought up again in the film by practically anyone. Not even Clue himself tries to say, well, I am the new god or anything. It just feels like a really shallow attempt at recreating the original's ideas by just throwing them out onto the audience, with no real time to develop them or give them proper context, which is a real shame, since that was one of the standout elements from the original, and one of the things that gave it a little more bite and longevity than a lot of 80s science fiction and fantasy films. In the end, to me, Tron Legacy wasn't really all it could have been. It wasn't the most abysmal, horrific thing ever created, but it just felt like they waited too long to put this idea together, and when they put it together, the right people just were not on board for this. Perhaps Tron 3 will fix these issues and perhaps bring everything back to top form, who knows.